Impending, Part 2. Everyone sat to the table and Miguel gave the grace. John spooned food onto his plate as Carolita poured his coffee. Continuing with the conversation, he said, "No, haven't been into town much. Too much work to do around the place. Luke's only home on the weekends and not always then, so all the heavy work falls to me alone since Dad died. Besides, there's not much reason to go anywhere." Miguel sipped his coffee and said, "Maybe you should have one of Mike's boys come out and help you. Jake and Stevie are big. They could do a lot of work." "Yes, they could," John agreed, "but Jake's gone off enjoying the recovery. I think he was feeling pretty confined at home, having turned 18 back in April, and his chances of going to college washed away with the tsunami. Probably do him some good. He was getting a little wild there for a time. Stevie would probably be happy to help, but it would be impolitic right now to have him over. In another couple of weeks I'll do it anyways, because I'm going to need the help felling trees." Carolita looked puzzled and said, "Why would it be impolitic for Steve to come to your place? He's a good boy, isn't he?" Arr. John would really rather not have answered that question, but the woman looked expectantly at him, so he finally said, "Well, he's pretty sweet on Heather, and just now I think Lisa would prefer he not see too much of her." Her eyes widened slightly. "I see," she said, and spoke no more about it. Casting about for something other than the problems of the kids in his household to talk about, he asked Miguel, "How's business been? You getting regular shipments again?" The other man shrugged. "It's been better, but we're getting by. One cannot buy through the official channels without the necessary permits, and the prices are steep. But what choice does one have? I buy what I must and mark my prices up accordingly. The fluff products like prepared foods are scarce and very expensive if you can get them, but the staples everyone must have to survive can be bought. Only fuel, dairy, eggs, and meat are rationed, but I suppose you wouldn't have to concern yourself much about those since you produce them yourself, except for fuel. In fact, if ever you have a surplus, I'd be happy to buy it from you direct." John grinned. "Well, next year we'll have surplus eggs at least. I don't usually put a chick order in until right about now for January delivery, but with things being the way they are and all, we cleaned up our old incubator a couple of weeks ago and fired her up. I expect our first batch of eggs to hatch starting next week sometime if we did it right. We're going to hatch out at least a couple of hundred over the next 2 months, maybe more if we can find folks that want to buy chicks. Come the end of April, beginning of May, we'll have cockerels for the table, and not long after that, the first pullet eggs will start coming in. Of course, these aren't meat birds, so they're not going to be the fat birds like Tyson sells." Carolita smiled. "The bird from which I made this aracompolo is one of our old hens. I don't think you'll have any problem selling those young roosters, even if they're not as meaty as what the Colonel offers. I think it's going to be a while before we see rationing end, so people will not be as discriminating as they once were. I'll buy some of them myself. A good free-range bird makes the best tasting chicken. We have always raised our own birds because they taste so much better. In fact, I'll buy some of your chicks. Our hatchery that we buy from is in Texas, so who knows if we'll be able to order from them again." Her husband asked, "You going to expand your flock in a big way? That takes a lot of time, doesn't it?" John shrugged. "Well, time is about all I have now. The university is steadily calling people back to work as they get the campus rehabilitated for the new semester starting next year, but they haven't called me. From talking to Ann, Luke, and a couple of others, the federal government is preoccupied with other things than funding research the way they did before the impact, so there's not much call for grant writers right now. Personally, between you and me, I think a lot of that's going to go back to the states. You've heard how resistant Tallahassee has been to being told what to do by Denver. We just may be starting to see a resurgence of states' rights and authority. Did you hear that Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont told the National Recovery Command to pack their bags and get out? They're making them do it too. National media isn't giving it much play, but it's on the short wave. Folks up there are really angry about the high-handed way General Steiner treated them. A good many of the western states have told the Bureau of Land Management to take a hike too, and are taking over administrative authority of everything but national parks, monuments, and forests. I expect the Supreme Court is going to have its hands full for a long time to come sorting this all out. The other men smiled. "Well, it would not break my heart to see our dear Uncle Sam have his sails trimmed a bit, but if the states force the federal government back into some 19th century model, it will mean a very great change in the way the nation conducts its affairs. Many people will be out of work. Swallowing a mouthful of rice and washing it down with some coffee, John replied. Reckon we've already seen that happen. In fact, an asteroid impact, nuclear war, or some other such major catastrophe would be the only thing I can think of that would cause it to come about. The federal government will still be in charge of the military, at least the non-National Guard parts of it, international affairs, and they're beginning to realize the impact is the best chance they've got, maybe ever will have, to lighten the yoke of federal authority. You know that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California took control of their National Guard units back from the president after he tried to federalize them. They're being deployed along the Mexican border instead of going overseas. Can't imagine the contention that must have caused. Likely couldn't have done it if the National Guard officers and troops themselves didn't support what their states were trying to do. The governor of New Mexico said flat out that if the Mexican governor didn't do something about keeping the Villistas on their side of the border, he'd send his troops across the border himself to take the fight to them. In fact, the 4 governors of the border states are supposedly signing an agreement about that exact thing, although it's not certain if California will play or not. I think those raids have been a lot worse than the media has been letting on. Miguel shrugged. To be expected, I suppose. There are so many Americans out of work now that the jobs the illegals once held are being sought after by citizens, leaving little or nothing for them. If they get desperate enough and think the government can't protect the border sometime, some will decide to come and take what they can no longer work to get. Naturally, the residents of those states are going to resist. Carolita asked, I've been too busy these last couple of days to keep up with the news. You said the government wanted to send National Guard troops overseas. Where to? John shrugged. I'm not sure, but I suspect they'd go to the Middle East. Iraq has come apart at the seams, with Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran all claiming pieces for themselves. And the president seems determined not to let them have it all. I think the Saudi Arabia United Arab Emirates has him spooked, since that al-Saladin fella seems to be really gaining a lot of popular support among the poorer classes and the fundamentalists. If they get away with grabbing a big part of Iraq, that will make his party that much stronger. Probably got a lot of moderate Gulf states spooked too. Sure seems like a bad time to be sending our National Guard troops overseas, though, when we're still not out of the woods here. Miguel looked sour. We should just let them fight it out amongst themselves. Does it matter to us who is in charge over there? They have to sell their oil regardless, and there's too many other competing oil nations for them to raise their prices too much. It would seem the president does not agree. I find it hard to believe he's not taking the Mexican border situation more seriously. John ate his last bit of rice. He threatened to send troops across the border, but since has done seemingly nothing. Can't say I blame the border state governors for forcing the issue about their guard troops. All right. Good night. Thank you. Sleep well.